Good morning, everyone. I know Mr. Williams is only a moment or two away, but we have folks who have another hearing to go to on the Senate side starting at 10, and so we're going to get started with our hearing now. And I really want to take a moment to welcome you all here to our first Sub-3 meeting of the new season. And I want to first welcome Mr. Williams in absentia, but also Rich Gordon back for another go-round, and welcome our new members to the committee, Dos Williams and Jay Obernolte. And I should have said Mr. Patterson, not Mr. Williams, coming back. Mr. Patterson, welcome back. And to our new members, I know this is going to be a very interesting experience for you, and something to look forward to. And I hope you'll enjoy it here because the speaker's not entertaining any requests for membership changes, as I understand it, so you're stuck. I also want to welcome back our returning staff, Gabrielle Meindl, who handles resources, and Christian Griffiths, who handles transportation for the committee, and of course Chris Holtz, who provides the analysis for the Republican caucus. It really kind of feels like a gathering of the family once again, especially to see all of you here today. We are, I think, focused on common goals, and we have a lot to look forward to this year. And for those of you who are returning, you know that this committee has had a central role. Welcome, Mr. Williams. A central role in some of the larger issues in the that the legislature has addressed over the last few years. In the midst of the worst drought that the state has faced since we began keeping records more than 150 years ago, we passed an emergency relief plan that appropriated $687 million for water supply, storage, and quality projects. And in response to the dangerously dry conditions due to the drought, we approved more than $200 million last year and provided 259 positions to CAL FIRE to assist with critical fire prevention and emergency preparedness. And thank goodness we did that. It had a big impact over the last year. We made investments in the Office of Spill Prevention and Response and the Public Utilities Commission to provide additional safeguards to the expansion of oil imports by rail coming to California. And it cannot be taken lightly that oil by rail increased 506% to 6.3 million barrels from 2012 to 2013. And I got to get this stat fact-checked. My notes say here that that's expected to increase from 6.3 to 150 million barrels, I should say, by 2016. That's an extraordinary increase. Additionally, we provided nearly $19 million to Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, affectionately known as DOGGR, to development of hydraulic fracturing regulations and to complete an independent scientific study on well stimulation treatments to better protect our public's health and safety against an activity that has been largely unfit. Even though it's been going on for many years, it's changed significantly, and the unfettered nature of it is something that is due to change. Now, this committee spearheaded reforms to the Public Utilities Commission, whose focus and priorities were called into question after the devastating gas line explosion in San Bruno that killed 8 people and left a community scarred. And in response, this committee zero-based that agency's budget, forcing a complete review of their responsibilities and, in a sense, justification for their funding. And we'll be hearing about that this year. And starting today. And last but not least, we invested $872 million of cap-and-trade revenues in the first year to begin to address our massive infrastructure needs in housing and transportation, while at the same time taking a serious leap forward in our fight against climate change, something that California is now recognized for around the world. But we have much more to do, and much of this work needs to address and respond to our most pressing matter, climate change. California's climate, the world's climate, is changing. It's posing a serious threat to our environment, to public health, and perhaps ultimately to our way of life. Of course, how quickly and severely this threat impacts us largely depends on how quickly and aggressively we are able to meet this challenge. For this reason, it is incumbent upon all of us here, legislators, agency heads, advocates, that as we review and assess and introduce and fix our policies and programs, that we do so with the understanding that solutions must not only address the issue in front of us, but protect the next generation of Californians from the threats posed by climate change. Everything we work on must approach our environment and its resources in the same way we approach a responsible budget. We must provide, but be efficient, live within our means, and do everything we can to not saddle future generations with excessive, unmanageable debt and burdens. Unfortunately, even if we do our part and meet whatever goals we set, we still have our challenges. We here in California can't legislate the behavior of other states or the international community. However, we can and do lead by example and hope that our successes will be adopted or expanded upon by others. For those of you who are fans of Dr. Seuss, particularly the Lorax, the Onceler once said, unless someone cares an awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And with that, I would like to invite our agency secretaries, beginning with Mr. Rodriguez, to address, in addition to your remarks, the following questions. To the extent that you can, please describe to the committee the key actions that you've taken this past year to reduce climate risk and respond to climate change. Describe to what extent you consider climate risk as a component of funding and permitting decisions, including grants. And please also describe what actions to this problem you're planning to take in this coming year and that are contemplated in your proposed budget. And finally, I want to say as our meetings go forward, we're going to ask each department to continuously update us on climate change actions so that we're really having this discussion front of mind and discussing it on an ongoing basis. Again, I want to welcome my fellow committee members and ask if any of you would like to add some comments at this time. All right, thank you. We will have public comment at the end of our hearing. And Mr. Gordon, I'm sorry, did you raise your hand? I got to get back in practice. Mr. Gordon. That's
okay. Thank you. Let me say that I'm glad to be back for my 5th year on the committee. And thank you, Mr. Chair. And want to just say that I'm very supportive of your focus on climate. I think that clearly, we are impacted in so many ways in this state, whether it be the issue of drought, whether it be what we do with cap and trade dollars and how we manage fossil fuels. So there are so many ways in which climate is really center to the things we will look at here as we look at resources and transportation. So I'm pleased that you've put that focus on it. I think that we've talked a lot in the past about being climate readiness. We've talked about ways in which we can deal with things. I think we probably also need to begin to be thinking about climate adaptation. What are we going to do in the long term to adapt California to what will be a changed environment? So I'm pleased with the focus and look forward to working with you. Thank you. And I won't call you the senior member of the committee, but as the member with the most experience on our sub-3 committee. Probably also the senior member. I want to thank you for your support. I do have a response to that, but it'll be offline. We can compare notes on who the senior member is. We're going to take roll now.
Bloom.
Here.
Gordon. Here. Obernolte. Here. Patterson. Here. Williams. Here.
Great. Thank you, members. And we'll begin with Secretary Matt Rodriguez with his overview of the Environmental Protection Agency budget. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Matt Rodriguez, the Secretary for Environmental Protection, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As the agenda indicates, the entire Cal EPA budget is a little over $3.8 billion. Of that, it's notable that only 1.8% is general fund. This budget supports just under 5,700 positions within 6 boards, departments, and offices within Cal EPA. Specifically, it supports the activities of the State Water Resources Control Board and the regional boards, the Air Board, Cal Recycle, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, and the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Now, the Secretary's office, I should quickly note, is a very, very small portion of that budget. Our budget is $19 million for 69 positions. And with those 69 positions, we do a number of programs, including running the Climate Action Team. We also oversee the CUPA program, which is the program that deals with hazardous waste generation and and hazardous waste facilities at the local level. And also we provide centralized services for the agency. Now, from the time that the governor took office, he has repeatedly emphasized the significance of the state's environmental programs. And in particular, I wanted to touch on 3 areas this morning. And in response to the chair's question about what have we done recently on climate change, let me just say that we continue to support the Air Resources Board and its programs in implementing AB 32. This afternoon, we should get the results of last week's auction. And so that will give us some insight into the auction process, particularly now that fuels are under the cap-and-trade program. And then, happily, one of the tasks that we've got is to spend the auction revenue. As you noted, California has the most progressive programs of any state, and if we were our own country, I would say a country for dealing with climate change issues. One of the most successful aspects of our program so far is the cap-and-trade program, which puts a price on carbon and creates incentives for the development of clean energy technologies. This year, under the legislature's guidance, we started investing proceeds from the cap-and-trade auctions back into additional programs that will further reduce carbon pollution and promote clean energy. As noted by the chair, we are spending $870 million this year, and these will be invested in a range of programs that will deal with low-carbon transportation, promote sustainable communities, promote energy efficiency, also invest in the high-speed rail program, and a number of other programs, including, for example, urban forestry programs. The budget for this year continues these investments with a proposed budget for $1 billion in cap-and-trade proceeds. The investment portfolio or list is basically the same programs. It's just that the funding is slightly increased. And I should note that both from the current expenditures and in this year's budget, a quarter of the cap-and-trade funds will have to benefit disadvantaged communities. And so we are ensuring that that will happen. Again, the primary focus of these programs will be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state, but we think that there will be many co-benefits, including helping the California economy and dealing with some of our other environmental problems such as air pollution. I should note then that we're also dealing with drinking water. As many of you may recall, the drinking water program was moved from the Department of Public Health to the State Water Resources Control Board. And the board's budget includes $268 million in Proposition 1 bond money to meet California's continuing commitment to ensuring that every Californian has a right to safe drinking water. The State Board, through its new Drinking Water Division, has been successful in ensuring that California's drinking water consumers from public water systems receive water that meets federal and state standards. But we recognize that more needs to be done, and there still remain, unfortunately, Californians that are without a reliable access to safe drinking water. So to that point, there are an estimated 500 public water systems in disadvantaged communities that rely on sources that fall short of safe drinking water standards. Many of these systems are in low-income communities, both urban and rural. And many of these communities lack the infrastructure in particular and the technical expertise and ability to pay for the costs of treating water. So because providing drinking water to all Californians is essential, $69 million is proposed in the budget to be available for loans and grants for public water system infrastructure improvements and related actions to meet safe drinking water standards and ensure affordable drinking water. Protecting water quality within the state is also very important. So a further $66 million is proposed for grants to small communities with priority given to disadvantaged communities for wastewater treatment projects. And we also need to continue to look at the state's water resources and ensure that there's a reliable water supply. So $132 million is provided in the budget for grants or loans to fund water recycling and advanced treatment technology projects. Recycled water will provide us with a alternative in times of drought, and so that's one of the reasons that we're emphasizing, efficient use of our water. Finally, let me talk about the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Over the past 3 years, the department has really initiated a number of major reforms in its core programs. Through its Fixing the Foundation initiative, the department has taken steps to improve its permitting process, to ensure that polluters are paying to clean up their contamination, and to recover the costs of the department's oversights. The department has made significant progress. We have a new director at the department. There have been some new folks that we've been able to bring into the executive staff, but there's still an awful lot that needs to be done. So the budget includes an increase of $1.6 million to help improve the effectiveness and timeliness of the permitting process and to reduce a backlog of permit applications. This will provide for 16 additional limited-term positions. There's also $840,000 that will be provided to the department to initiate programs to reduce the production of hazardous waste at the source. If we can prevent hazardous waste from being produced, then that will make it easier for us to deal with it in the hazardous waste issues in the future. So these are just a couple of the initiatives that you will see reflected in the budget for Cal EPA. It's a significant responsibility to work on improving the state's environment, but the state's environment is the backbone of the state. It's the backbone of our economy, and we think that this budget will help us to continue to promote the environmental programs that are so important to the state of California. So with that, I can answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. With respect to the statutory requirement that you mentioned to utilize 25% of cap-and-trade funds for the benefit of disadvantaged communities, can you go into just a little bit of detail about how that is working out so far?
Well, we have identified, and in fact, I was entrusted with the responsibility to identify disadvantaged communities in California. So working with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, we developed a tool that is called Cal EnviroScreen, which looks at a variety of indicators, both environmental and socioeconomic, to identify areas in the state that are disadvantaged. And the departments and boards that are then developing programs to spend cap-and-trade funding will be looking at those disadvantaged communities to ensure that the appropriate amounts of money are spent to help those communities. In fact, our estimate is that probably a little bit more than 25%. Our estimate right now is about 30% of the funds will go to help disadvantaged communities. And those would be programs such as helping with public transit in these areas, helping plan and provide housing near transit areas, promoting urban forests in these areas. So there are a variety of also energy efficiency in the housing stock in these areas to reduce energy bills. So we have worked with the programs to ensure that they're familiar with this tool so that we can properly target the use of cap and trade funds.
Going forward, is there going to be one place that is a sort of clearinghouse for all cap and trade issues that an agency or group that is going to issue an annual report or anything like that that tracks our progress and expenditures?
ARB is working on a report that should be available next week that sort of tracks where the expenditures are right now, as I understand it. And we are working collaboratively with the Air Resources Board and also through the Climate Action Team to ensure that there's one site that will be able to tell the public where the cap and trade funds are going, how they're being spent. It requires coordination with a large number of boards and departments who are responsible for these various programs, but we are going to have a single site so that people can see how cap and trade funds will be spent.
With respect to the beverage container recycling fund, a fun topic that we spent a lot of time on in our last session, apparently the timeline for when that fund goes upside down has been moved back by a year, and the governor hasn't proposed any fixes for it, I think, in the current budget. Can you describe where we are and what efforts might be taking place to figure out how to resolve those issues?
Well, I should note that I never travel too far without the state auditor's report on that program.
Nice
and I will say that we are looking at, I think, an April report on the status of the fund, so we should know what the status of the fund is at that point. As you noted, we know we're overspending out of that program because of the efficiency of the program, the recycling program. But the time when there's really a crunch, if you will, has been pushed forward a little bit from where the projections of several years ago. So that gives us a little bit more time to figure out fixes to the program. So what we're doing right now is continuing to look at, are there ways that we can protect the funds through enforcement? And is there more we can do through enforcement? A lot has been done recently on enforcement. We continue to look at that. And then we'll work with the stakeholders to look at some of the other costs that go into that program, some of the subsidies that are provided, some of the administrative costs that are charged to that program, to see if there are some savings there. So it's really a point of working with the stakeholders at this point.
Good. I'm glad to hear that you're continuing to work on it. I know Sacramento is a place that's kind of used to doing crisis-based management, and that provides the context in which many problems are solved. But if we can get out ahead of this one, that would be a much better practice. Mr. Gordon, did you have a question?
Just to follow up on that, one of the things that concerns me is that the fund going upside down has been a moving target.
Yes.
For the past several years, 4 or 5 years. And we keep putting off then really coming to grips with the fact that there are multiple stakeholders in this program that are going to have to come to the table and find some way to resolve some of the subsidy issues, manage some of the fraud issues in order to make this a viable program ongoing. So sooner rather than later would be better.
I appreciate that, and we are working with the stakeholders, and I think we do want to avoid that decision in time of crisis situation. So we're looking at what the status of the fund is, and then working with the stakeholders. And then we anticipate we should be able to come back to you in the legislature and say, look, we've looked at all the options. We've looked at enforcement. We know that there are some questions about whether we could save money through enforcement. We've looked at the administrative costs. So we'll be able to say that we've thoroughly investigated all the options, and we'll be coming to you with a recommendation on what we think is the best course forward based on that study. So we don't want to wait until the last moment.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in your testimony, you said that you expect that cap-and-trade revenues are going to increase by $2 to $3 billion this year as the result of the phase-in of the carbon-based fuel. So, but we've only programmed $1 billion of that for actual expenditures. Can you tell us when the other $1 to $2 billion will be programmed and what that money will be spent on?
My testimony was that there's $1 billion that we plan for in this budget. We've resisted at the agency and ARB at trying to make projections or estimates of exactly how much money will come in through the cap-and-trade program this year, for the reason that this is a market. And we can't really control a market. And also we have to be concerned about making projections that might somehow affect the market in some way. And so we're waiting actually to get some experience from these auctions, and that experience should indicate to us a little bit more about what sort of money may be coming in. So right now we're just planning for $1 billion, and we'll see whether additional funds are coming in. As you noted, there are some folks who have been talking about in excess of $2 billion coming in this year. I'll note that there's a continuing appropriation for some of these programs, and so I think 60% of the cap-and-trade funds are continuously appropriated. That means there's some play in the remaining 40%, but I think the legislature was very wise when several years ago it said that rather than sort of do a piecemeal approach to the expenditure of cap-and-trade funds, there should be an investment plan that directs how these funds will be used. We prepared that an investment plan for 3 years several years ago, and we'll be starting a new investment plan process this year. And in fact, we're looking at potential schedule for workshops. So we're going to be looking at a new investment plan that we will then take to the Department of Finance, and that should help us to direct future expenditures of cap-and-trade funding.
All right. Thank you.
I think that $2.3 billion estimate came from the LAO, who will be speaking at the end of our meeting, so we can address that question at that time, too. And as you mentioned, we'll have better information this afternoon and can probably make some better projections based on the outcome of the first auction. Mr. Williams.
My question is just on what kind of analysis goes in after the first year in terms of what expenditures were able to reduce GHGs more, whether by projecting or by doing an actual analysis. How much checking are we doing on what was effective and what wasn't?
For a wide variety of reasons, both legal and practical, we really understand the necessity to build in the metrics into these programs so that at the end of the day we'll be able to come back and tell individuals and the public what sort of reductions we were able to obtain through these programs. So we're working on those metrics and putting those into the programs right now. So there will be coming back at the end of the day to have a report that will talk about the greenhouse gas reductions that we obtained through these programs. So we're building that into them right now. And we anticipate that will be another thing that we'll put on the website that we'll be able to talk about reductions. So we are building those metrics into the programs right now.
And I would specifically look particularly at one of the things I think looking back, and I didn't raise a stink about it beforehand, so I'm not going to cast any blame, but looking at the amount of monies that were put out, but looking at transit funding of only being 25 in each pot, so a grand total of 50 for probably something that affects disadvantaged communities more than any other, but in addition to affecting disadvantaged communities more than any other, reducing GHGs more than just about anything else we can do. And I'm glad that it's part of the continuously appropriated portion, but particularly in light of Governor Brown's speech on reducing carbon content of our transportation, what are the plans of what are your plans this year and in the future to make sure that that expansion happens at a grand scale?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, we will be working on a new investment plan, which should be looking at, where can we obtain the most reductions for our money. As you identified, transportation is a big part of the greenhouse gas puzzle, if you will, here in California. 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions are related to transportation. And so we'll be looking at should more money be going into transportation. I will say that while only the portion that you named goes directly to transportation, the transportation agency for programs, there is a low-carbon transportation element that is being administered by the Air Resources Board. That's $200 million. There also will be looking, one of the things that we're looking at the Strategic Growth Council is how we can have sustainable communities developed around transit hubs and transit areas. Are there things that we can do through land planning that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce vehicle miles traveled, for example, hook up housing with transportation hubs. So transportation actually is an element of a number of these programs, but it's something that we need to continue to look at because, as you identified, it's a big part of the puzzle.